Hi, my name is Russ Gifford, and welcome to History at High Noon. Very happy to be able to do this in conjunction with the Sioux City Public Museum, who take care of all the wonderful things that you folks have come to know and love about American history and local history specifically. And we're going to combine those two things in this program. So these are the things I'd like you to consider while we're getting started discussing this great battle that occurred 75 years ago now. How did over 3 years of war lead us to a massive battle on a little tiny island about 8 miles square that no one in America had ever heard of? What's the differences between the Pacific War and the European War? Are there differences? Those are things we will discuss. And what part did technology play in the war in the Pacific? These are the things I'd like you thinking about. Of course, the biggest thing I'd like you thinking about, why do we strive to remember these battles from so long ago? They happened, they're history, they're gone, they're past. How can history affect us today, right? Well, those are the things that we're going to be discussing today. Of course, it all started with Pearl Harbor, a day which will live in infamy. Japan's surprise attack on December 7th, 1941, again on an island that most Americans could not have found with a map and a directory before 1941, would change history. The war came because the United States had applied sanctions against, in our terms today, sanctions against Japan. They had cut off all the oil, and of course, Japan was already in the process of a war against China. It was moving into the vacuum in the Pacific that was caused largely by the war in Europe. Russia was distracted, which had been a traditional enemy for Japan. In fact, Russia had been the first victim of Japan. It was the first Western power to be defeated by a non-Caucasian group in detail, in a large-scale battle, not just a skirmish the way we had at Little Bighorn, but very seriously, the Japanese-Russia War in 1905 really had only stopped because Theodore Roosevelt had stepped in and negotiated a peace, thinking it was in America's best interest that Japan did not get any stronger at that point. And he did so by demonstrating the fleet he had been building to both the Japanese and the Russians, essentially saying, look, this is something you will have to worry about, something you'll have to consider. And the fleet, in this case, by 1940, had been moved to a forward base because of all the things the Japanese were doing in the Pacific, and that forward base was Pearl Harbor. Now, the Japanese only wanted two things from us. They wanted us to stop criticizing their very bloody war in China and to lift the embargo that we'd placed on oil. And the Japanese thought the American public would be intimidated by a show of force, and their entire intention, of course, was to incapacitate the American fleet, since they knew America would be a potential enemy. Remember, at this point, Britain and the Dutch have their hands full in Europe in 1941, fighting with Germany. So this is a strategic play by the Japanese. The reality is the attacks on the U.S. were Japan's greatest mistake. They created an enemy that would never quit. And it truly changed world history from that moment on. Congress declared war on Japan with no hesitation. There was one negative vote in the House, otherwise it was unanimous. Germany had decided to add on. They declared war on the U.S. They didn't have to. Their treaty with Japan did not say they needed to, but they wanted to. And in fact, by doing so, they would seal their own fate as well. What does not seem to be very obvious to people outside of the U.S. is the United States still to this day conducts warfare along the lines of the way Andrew Jackson conducted war. If you strike us, if you hurt us, we will hunt you down and destroy you. Now, afterwards, we will work very hard to build you back up, and we will see that in Japan. We've seen that really in every war we've conducted. But the idea at this point of fighting a two-ocean war seemed unthinkable to most Americans, but the fact was that for a number of years, the smart people in the United States government had been looking at the fact that war could come, and if so, it could possibly be a two-ocean war, and what should we do? In reality, those same people only committed 15% of America's resources to the Pacific War initially. And why? Why is that? That's because those generals had long recognized that Japan could not maintain a prolonged combat with the U.S. Our ability to produce would far outstrip anything Japan could do. And remember that the whole reason Japan wanted the oil is because at the time we placed an embargo on them, at the very best, they had 2 years worth of oil supply, and under war circumstances, where you'd use it much more quickly, 18 months was more likely. So the other thing that we don't think about, because we, being Americans, are pretty egocentric, one thing we don't think about is Pearl Harbor was just one of the surprise attacks on December 7th, and because the international dateline December 8th, they coupled those with attacks in Manila, Singapore, Indochina, and others. Their main goal was to make sure that they got to the Dutch East Indies because there was oil there, and they needed those oil fields to continue to wage their wars. Now, Japan knew that Great Britain and the Dutch were tied down with Nazi battles. Russia was in the process of dismantling and taking over Poland with Germany, and they were certain that the United States would not fight. The United States had ignored provocations both in the Atlantic from the German fleet and in China. The Pinoy was sunk, and the Japanese had actually machine gunned the survivors of that transport. They really believed the United States had no interest and no desire to fight. And 3 years later, after numerous battles, on the eve of February 19, 1945, the Americans were about to invade the first small little island that had been claimed by the Japanese from before the war. It was a rocky volcano island called Iwo Jima. How did we get there, and why? Why were we there? Now, something we need to remember is technology had changed warfare on the ocean completely. Warfare really changed between World War I and World War II. The entire concept of the blitzkrieg was the use of, on land, of the Germans had perfected, was the use of armored vehicles to break through, then turn around and surround the enemy and defeat them in detail, rather than just pushing them back. The same thing was true on the ocean, but we really didn't recognize it because it didn't come into play in the Atlantic. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself was only possible because of improved planes, carriers, and torpedoes. Those torpedoes had to be adjusted. America thought that Pearl Harbor was far too shallow for a normal plane to drop a torpedo and have any chance of success. They would go too deep. But the Japanese had used technology to advance those torpedoes. Now, other things were coming along. If you really think about it, radio was hardly perfected, and definitely not airplanes for World War I. So radar comes along for World War II. Aircraft carriers are now becoming a big part of it. Naval battles now, especially in the Pacific, we're going to see some of these early battles between Japan and the U.S. where the enemy ships never spy each other. They never see each other. That's an incredible concept, and really up to 1939, the Japanese still believed that any warfare in the Pacific would be conducted in the old-fashioned way, where you have two lines of opposing ships lining up, the big battleships, and they would use their guns and try and send each other to the bottom. The reality is that all changes with airplanes and the aircraft carriers, where you seek out these ships and try to sink them with planes and dive bombers. And of course, considering that is how they inflicted the losses of 8 of those battleships in Pearl Harbor, it's ironic that really the Japanese did not grasp how important this was. Now, there would be a number of battles, and within a few months of Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Coral Sea was not conclusive. It was really a draw, but a draw was all America needed at that point, to prove to the Japanese that we were willing to fight and we would not be a pushover. The Battle of Midway was even more important. It was halfway to Hawaii, and the whole concept was, having realized that the fleet was not destroyed in Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wanted to come back, and he thought that he would do that first by attacking the Aleutians to draw the fleet out, and then attack Midway, and then be able to use Midway as a staging area to take Hawaii itself. Again, the goal is to destroy the American fleet and thus expand what the Japanese could do. The irony in all this is, again, technology comes into play. The United States had cracked the Japanese code. They were completely aware of what Yamamoto had intended. And so while Yamamoto is creating a trap for the Americans at Midway, the Americans are allowing them to think that the trap is working and are creating their own trap. And in many ways, Midway, the Battle of Midway, is America's revenge for Pearl Harbor. 4 of the carriers that are involved are the same 4 Japanese carriers that had executed the battle on Pearl Harbor. And the Americans would send 3 of those carriers to the bottom. They would lose the Yorktown, but in reality they don't lose it. Its damage was not as deep as the Japanese thought, and it would be resurrected. But the reality is, again, this is that concept of how Andrew Jackson always conducted warfare. We were not just interested in avenging Pearl itself. We were going to defeat the Japanese. No one was stopping. The victory at Midway would allow the first real land combat. Now remember, there had been land battles because of the invasions. At the same time that Pearl happened, the Japanese had taken on, for America, had taken on the Philippines. So there had been land battles before this, but the first big land battle was Guadalcanal, and part of that was the realization that the Japanese were planning to use that as a way to isolate Australia and strike deeper, even with the reverses at Midway. But with those reverses at Midway, the Americans decided they could take those fields, those airfields that were being created on Guadalcanal, and in a surprise attack they did so. Now they pushed back the Japanese enemy. This became known as Operation Watchtower. They would strike and take them back, but at the exact same time, it would lead to a 6-month set of protracted battles over Guadalcanal. And it only is a success for the Americans because they had seized those airfields. Again, that change in technology and a combined ad hoc group of desperate flyers would sustain the Marines because a task force of Japanese ships had defeated the American battleships and it forced the transports to withdraw. The divisions of Marines that are on Guadalcanal were isolated except for the airfield they had come in to take, the airfield that was just being completed by the Japanese. So there's a lot of heavy irony here, and there's a lot of desperation on both sides. And the Japanese would throw everything they've got at Guadalcanal and those Marines. And that Air Force group, I shouldn't say Air Force, it was a combined Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft groups that would keep that supplied, would deny the Japanese the ability to land on Guadalcanal, and would set up everything that's going to happen from here on out. Because with the success, finally, of Guadalcanal, the Americans have broken the concept after 6 months of protracted battles. They've broken that myth of Japanese superiority. They've broken that entire idea that the Japanese can't lose. Because remember, they had been going from victory to victory to victory all across the Pacific, expanding that area that we saw. It looked bleak, even though our planners were saying, no, really, we're putting 85% of our resources into the war in Europe. And I'd said, why did we do that? You have to realize everything I've just described, all of Japan's efforts were opportunistic ones. They all occurred because Japan knew that the great powers, England, the Dutch at that time, not quite a great power, but still a remnant of one, the Russians, were all distracted in America. And those planners in America all knew that while they could, if they defeated the Japanese outright, it would not lead to the defeat of Germany. But they could be positive that the defeat of Germany in Europe would definitely lead to the defeat of Japan, because of course you would then have the entire Royal Navy added to the American Navy in the Pacific. You would have Russia able to join in. No matter what, the defeat in Europe would lead to the defeat in Japan. That didn't mean there weren't desperate times like those 6 months on Guadalcanal, and those Marines had actually held out and broken that myth of Japanese superiority. That was as important for the Japanese to learn as it was for the Americans to learn. Tarawa, also known as Bloody Tarawa, would follow then in November of 43. As you see, we have the concept of island hopping as we're going forth. And Tarawa would again create a number of events. It would be the first true amphibious assault. The Japanese would meet them at the shoreline, determined to throw them back, and it would lead to thousands of American deaths. And the American public was not quite ready for the scale of this. There was some questioning, and that would go on, especially as it would continue to escalate. And this is always going to be in the back of America's mind. What is the situation? How do you actually defeat people who are willing to die to the last man rather than surrender? Because that is the one issue that the Americans are finding as they are engaging in these land battles, that they cannot get surrenders. And at Tarawa, we also first see the circumstances. There had been some before this, but we start to see the issues of a completely different mindset, a completely different culture coming forward in these battles. At one of the battles, it appears the Japanese are defeated, a small group of them. They call for assistance, they call for medics, and then when the medics get there, they attack and murder them as the force had come up with the medics. They surprise them, and in doing so, they would absolutely infuriate the Americans, and the change in the way the battles are fought on land then occurs. It becomes apparent that you cannot expect a surrender, and it would make changes because any surrender was seen as a trap. Saipan in June of '44, again, yet another island event, and the Americans are figuring out how to do these amphibious landings. They're gaining skill, knowledge, and success because they've come to realize the way the Japanese fight these battles. Generally with meeting them at the water's edge, generally trying to repulse them, and if they don't, with these suicidal bonsai charges, which were effective, but at the same time, since on all of these islands, the Japanese did not have the ability to get reinforcements, so it really would lead to a trade in forces, while the Americans did not like to do that math where they were trading one for one. It still worked out for them to be a victory. Now, after Saipan, with Boeing's new B-29 long-range bombers could reach and bring the war to Japan. But there were no fighters that could go that distance. And without fighter protection, then the planes would have only their own protection, their own guns. The bombers will only have their own guns to defend themselves over Japan, and also any damages, they had a long way back to the Marianas to be able to have a place to land, to have some place they could retrofit. So the real thorn in the side, though, is the Japanese built airstrips on a little volcanic island called Iwo Jima, and thus they could harass the fighters or the bombers on the way in, but more importantly, they could send their own bombers off of Iwo Jima, and they were destroying U.S. bombers at Saipan and in the Marianas. They were destroying more of them on the ground than were lost in attacking Japan, and that was something that the Americans could not allow to continue, and thus Iwo Jima becomes a target. All these realities is going to make this speck of rock in the middle of the ocean, this 8-mile square little pork chop shaped island, is going to become the prime target for the U.S. Marines in early 1945. Also, there's the advantage that if these airfields that the Japanese have made, much like we saw with the situation in Guadalcanal, if these are captured, it's going to give American fighters, it's only 600 to 800 miles to Japan from Iwo Jima, it's going to give the American fighters the ability to provide coverage on all these bombing raids, and more importantly, any of the bombers that are damaged are now going to have someplace they can land after the attacks, and thus you do not lose the crew, you do not lose the plane, and you have the ability. This is the setup. As you can see, the little red squares are showing you the positions of the Japanese, and you can see off on the bottom where the Americans intend to land. And it is, it's looking like it's largely undefended down there. And you see all the way down the bottom tip, that's the volcano that's overlooking everything. Now, with this, realize as well, American intelligence really believe this is a volcanic island, and thus the one thing that's known about those is fresh water is always in short supply. The Americans believed there could be no more than 11,000 to maybe 12,000 men on this island, and they intend to hit it with 70,000 men. So, the concept in their mind was the outcome is not in doubt. We've learned from these previous uh, amphibious assaults that we can do this, how to do this, what's going to happen, etc. Well, one thing, the intelligence did get it wrong. There were 21,000 enemy forces on this. They had been on half water rations for months beforehand. And what they also didn't know is the people in charge were a uh, craftier crew. They had looked and saw, they too had learned from Saipan, from Tarawa, and said meeting them at water's edge is not the key. We need to husband our resources. We need to make the Americans pay a high price, and we can do that by attacking from hiding. And what happens is Japan will send out um, engineers, and this entire island, which is made out of rock that can be easily tunneled, becomes a massive fortification with an incredible number of pillboxes connected by tunnels to various areas, so that even when you overcome and overrun a pillbox at great expense in human life on the American side, all you've really captured is that pillbox because the troops have faded away into the tunnels. Now, this planning map on the upper right is where Iwo Jima is. So you can see it's a smaller force. They're showing that um, essentially 3 divisions are going to come in, whereas um, over here the battle for Okinawa is in the planning sessions, and that's going to have a whole lot more up to it. And in fact, in doing so, what happens is they, um, due to other planning, they delay the attack on Iwo Jima by a month, and that gives the Japanese even more time to create even more deadly pitfalls. So this battle is going to shape up to be very bad. But we need to realize something. The war in the Pacific, in America, we're very ingrained about World War II, but most of what we think about is what we hear about all the time, which is the war in Europe, what the war looked like there. You know, armies marching to and fro, sometimes confronting around towns, but generally having massive attacks where they can maneuver. That's not how it works in the war in the Pacific. You have, the naval battle, which we've talked about and how that works, but so much of the war in the Pacific is in jungle areas, not clearer areas and not towns, and they are in pitched battles, meaning nobody's going to come in to reinforce the defenders, and where you're at is where you are at. Uh, there is no concept of big maneuvers by groups. It's a battle. You line up and you run at each other. So the objectives are creating a difference between the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. And the type of warfare, because of course the heavy jungle areas, um, the defenders can use um, that heavy terrain to be able to attack from ambush, to attack from hidden areas, and thus snipers become a very big part of this. And in fact, snipers will be the constant thorn in the side in Iwo Jima. Now, there's also the concept that the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe are very, very different. It's the drastic technology difference between the United States, as we saw, constantly churning out more and more weaponry. You heard how I said that they created this long-range bomber and everything else. The technology differences, and thus the engagement of the people at home, is on an entirely different level. The engagement of the people in Japan, just as an example, at one point, an entire town in Japan, a large city, comes together and they make these balloons that suspend beneath them explosive packages, and they call upon the ancestors to bring the divine wind and send these aloft, thousands of these balloons aloft from the island of Japan, knowing that the winds are going to carry them toward America. Just the drastic difference in the technology level. America is sending bombers over Japan by this point. Japan is sending back balloon booby traps, which only by sheerest of luck will reach America. Only a few are ever seen to explode, and as far as I know, only one actually leads to a death. They're really more of a terrorist concept, but it highlights the difference in the technology levels between what Japan was capable of delivering and what America was delivering to Japan. So I want you to think about that. That so well sums up some of the differences. But there's another difference, and it's something that both sides were apparent. I'd spoken of the fact that part of this, but very early on after those attacks, December 7th and 8th, the treatment of the prisoners in the Philippines and in Malaya and Singapore and everywhere else, the treatment of the prisoners by the Japanese speaks volumes to the cultural differences that exist between Japan and the Western world. If you became a prisoner of war in Europe, you had a 99 out of 100% chance of living through the experience. If you became a prisoner of Japan, you had a 2 out of 3 chance, a 66% chance of living through it, and not well. They did not treat prisoners with any respect because they saw the concept of anybody that would surrender as being totally dishonorable and thus totally without merit to society. And thus, we also see the cultural difference that prevents the Japanese from surrendering. In the case of on the high seas, when a battleship is sunk and Americans try to rescue those people in the water, frequently they will work to drown themselves because the last thing they want is to have is to be dishonored by being seen as somebody back home, by being seen as somebody who might have surrendered. These cultural differences, when we come to face-to-face battles, will become huge. In all cases, if by some method a member of the Japanese army is captured, they would give false names because they knew that their family would be dishonored and possibly harassed, possibly beyond humiliated. They could be hurt physically because they would have been seen to have created someone who dishonored the country by surrendering. These cultural differences really point to a race war. World War II battle in the Pacific honestly becomes a race war. and there are rarely prisoners taken. On this level, the only thing in the war in Europe that is similar is the battles at Stalingrad between the Russians and the Germans, where there is no quarter given or taken. So, as the battle for Iwo Jima is being prepared, the commander has studied the previous American invasions. He uses his time to honeycomb the island with defensive tunnels that connect to hard points, blockhouses, pillboxes that have guns. He has 1,000 artillery pieces. He has 21,000 men. The only thing they're short of is water, and they actually are able to do fine with that. Come the battles, one of the things that will actually happen is at night they will infiltrate American lines to gain supplies and water, and at the same time knife the Americans in their foxholes. It becomes a very, very terrible war on this island, mainly because of all of these hidey holes that each side has. But Iwo was part of the homeland. They were going to make America pay rather than allow them to just capture it. So, he realized previous defensive plans are faulty. He's not going to oppose the landing at the shoreline. He's going to allow the invading Americans to come ashore. After they get to the shore, he's going to turn it into a killing zone of machine guns and artillery, and he refused to allow his subordinates to conduct the honorable banzai charges, which, while frightening to the Americans, these are devastating attacks, they always cost the attackers more than the Americans. So, the morning of the invasion, there is an intensive ship bombardment, but it's largely ineffective against these islands because they're not even spotted. The few that are spotted are because there had been a small group that had gone ashore the day before to find landmines and clear all those out, and they had highlighted a few targets. It had allowed those to be wiped out, but what the Americans did not know is that most of that bombardment that they had laid down that was so intensive was largely ineffective. As you can see, there's a ridge line back there, and they have to come onto the shore, go up that ridge, and they will do so with little opposition. The biggest opposition was the odd composition of the volcanic sand. It was very soft. Some of these Marines would jump off into the sand. The initial group find themselves buried in it up to their thigh, and with their heavy packs have a hard time moving. But they weren't opposed at the shoreline, and unlike Tarawa, unlike Saipan, there are no coral reefs. This is an unopposed invasion, and it goes very well off the start. The initial groups will make the top of that shore. They do have a few artillery pieces open up on them, and in fact, as an example of just how difficult this battle is going to be, many of those have to be taken out hand to hand because the defensive character of where these artillery pieces are hidden makes them really invulnerable to small arms fire. Things are starting to happen fast. It's slowing the troops. That even the tracked vehicles might have trouble, and making it to those high ridges and plateaus becomes very difficult. But the initial group gets on. Now the beaches are going, anything with wheels is going to be stuck and buried. Some of the tracks will even have trouble, but the first wave makes it on. They make it past that plateau, and they're going in. But the interesting thing is they see very few enemy. And here on this tip of the island, they're largely unopposed. But what does happen is the second wave comes in, and while they're waiting for the first to clear off out of their way, so the first wave to clear out of their way so they can go up. The first wave, the few enemy they have found have been snipers, have been things like that, and thus they're sending their wounded back to the shore to be picked up and taken back out to the ships to be cared for. But as the second wave is coming in and the wounded are on the shoreline waiting to be picked up, both are caught in a deadly crossfire from artillery and enemy mortars, which the Japanese have more than enough of these weapons to make life hell on those beaches. Based on previous experiences, the American commanders had assumed that it would take 4, maybe 5 days to take the island. That's the way it had worked in all the previous amphibious assaults. It would take 35 days. 71,000 Americans would invade this island. They would be sent ashore. 20,000 of them become wounded. Almost 7,000 would die in action on this island. That's actually more than the defenders that are present. There's only 21,000 defenders present. Ed O'Donnell of Sioux City remembers it was a very unusual battle. We never saw the enemy. Now, the close nature of the fighting then, because they would allow the Americans to come up very close, saw new weapons in use on both sides. The Japanese had created this massive mortar. It was a 325 millimeter mortar as opposed to their standard 25 millimeter mortar. If the 25 millimeters are bad, a 325, it has very limited range. It doesn't have to get very far. It's just lofting things to that beach. Now, the Japanese also had a highly inaccurate rocket launch bombs to rain down on the beach. Now, the big thing is no Marine that survives that island fight ever forgot the fear of this concept of this bomb coming at them that looks like a 55-gallon drum, and it's tumbling out of the sky, and they're positive it's heading directly for their foxhole. Now, initial reports coming back tell us that the Americans have inflicted heavy casualties and that they have counted almost 2,000 deaths, dead Japanese, from the initial waves. But the reality is there's at least in the first day, at least that many Americans that are dead. As I said, there's 68, I shouldn't say dead, that are actually casualties. As you can see from this one of the very earliest articles, they capture the airfield quickly, but the battle is grim and slow, but the Yanks are gaining. Those early days, the first few days, the reality is that the Americans made a lot of progress, but very shortly thereafter, that progress is going to be measured in yards, not miles. Time magazine combat correspondent who had seen earlier landings in the Aleutians, the Gilberts, the Marianas, reports that the dead at Iwo Jima, whether it's Japanese or American, had one thing in common. They all died with the greatest possible violence. Nowhere in the Pacific War had I seen such badly mangled bodies. And he goes on to explain what that is, but I don't really want to say that. It's pretty terrible how bad it is. And that is the kind of fighting that all of these men are experiencing. And those that are there, most of them already have experience at Tarawa. They have experience at SAIPAN. This is the worst they've ever seen. But the early gains are good. The forward troops are pushing, and the Americans are waiting for the inevitable banzai charge. They expect it that night. They expect it the next night. It never came. They were not getting a free pass from the Japanese. The ambushes became the standard attack, the snipers, and over again as you read these accounts, it's this, a sniper blew out my shoulder or my knee or my leg, um, and for those men, if it was the arm or the leg, they were out of that battle. They would be sent back to the ships if they could get back to the ships, because just moving back to the shore was not an easy thing after this. Essentially, the initial expectations were completely wrong. The Japanese had learned from the earlier fights that headlong attacks might satisfy honor, but they did not win the battle. Americans are going to have to adjust as well. But on the fourth day, there's wild cheering heard across the front. Ship horns and whistles can be heard from the sea. The flag's up, someone said, and all eyes turned to the volcano. There it was, the stars and stripes snapping smartly in the wind. And you'll notice this picture, held by Alvern Moscow of Sioux City, is from the initial raising of the flag, the first flag. And he's got it signed by, at that time, one of the last survivors of that flag raising. Telegrams and newspapers will carry the story home. 5 days, 1 hour, and 30 minutes after the American Marines of the 5th Division waded across the black beaches of the southern end of the island, the American flag flew for the first time from the summit of the crater at Iwo Jima. Now, even this newspaper report would say the battle is far from over. These people had no idea how far it was from over. I'd said that Al had that signed picture because he was not far from the place when it was raised. Charles Lindbergh of Grand Forks, North Dakota, would be one of the men in the original flag raising, and he would write that everything broke loose as they got the flag up. The men below began to cheer, ships out in the bay began to hoot. I tell you, it just made you shiver all over. Bob Mason, who later lived in Laurel after he came back but was originally from South Sioux City. Look, it's the flag. You turned and you could see it. Gave you confidence things were going well for us. We have letters that came home from people fighting there. This one from Alfie Alberts in Orange City. With a chill running up my spine and tears in my eyes, I saluted. I'll never forget that moment. It's a picture of his wife rereading the letter years later. And we see, that's about right, thought Private J. Rebstock. Many of the Marines felt this. The shipboard briefing had said 4 or 5 days is all it would take. It's almost over. It would not be over. Rebstock's, who was one of the first wave people, next day, one ridgeline after another waited. The never-ending Japanese artillery and mortar fire poured down on them. It was a Jap pillbox. Other Marines attacked the flanks, and the flamethrower operator was down before he could reach the pillbox. Another man took his place, and he too went down. Third man retrieved the flamethrower, and soon there was a familiar whoosh and the telltale orange tongue of fire before he was hit as well. The life expectancy of the flamethrower man was short. He was a prime target for every Japanese soldier who could see him. This battle would rage for 35 days. Almost the entire force of Japanese would sacrifice their lives, but 20,000 Marines would be wounded, and an additional 6,800 Marines would die on the island. More men would die on the transports back. Meaning that men that were grievously wounded would still have trouble surviving. But afterwards, and these are stories that I'm picking out of the Sioux City paper, we were told it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't. We were told, however, it was vital, and we were determined. That's Simon Braslaw. He added, though, and this is something you see over and over again in all the stories, I never want to go through anything like that again if I live to be 1,000 years old. So why do we remember? Why are we looking at this 75 years later? We remember because the scale of the effort is almost unfathomable, the sacrifice is too great to imagine, and the sacrifice should not be forgotten. Ed O'Donnell, who we quoted earlier about never seeing the enemy, survived the Battle of Iwo Jima. But his brother Tom O'Donnell, the first wave of Marines, died on the beach in the first 2 weeks. Many, many others from the Siouxland area would also be wounded or killed. We see the one that says Sergeant Bluff Youth, Private Pershing. Actually, it's listed that he died of those wounds. Emmitsburg, small towns all across the area. Some were lucky, if you can call a wound lucky. But all of these people experienced the hell that was Iwo Jima. Bodies would be sent home. The papers would have list after list after list of the wounded or the dead. So we remember because the sacrifice is unfathomable, and that sacrifice was forever, not just for those men, but for their families, for those who loved them. It's become an enduring symbol of men willing to fight and to die for their loved ones and for their country. You see your buddies dying left and right. You look back and see them floating in the water, and the water's all turning red. I was lucky. You'll never forget that. It's from Frank Raymond from Little Sioux. He's actually speaking of a different battle, but the truth is it's the same. It's the same thing we see over and over. Al Moscow would just say, I was there, but I was one of the lucky ones. Those that say they were the lucky ones. Injured but make it through. There's a picture of Al and somebody that he had saw throughout. They would be separated when they came back to America. Wounded Marines arriving in the U.S. Here's a photo of Mel Woodward, who passed away not long ago, who went on to make a big difference in the Siouxland area. There's also those that had no visible wounds, but, and this is true for so many of them, for 40 years, I never told anyone. That was from Norman Baker. At the time, he was an 18-year-old Marine. First night, they'd dug in, and when he woke up the next day, he found that his best friend was dead in another foxhole. He had been stabbed by one of those that had been infiltrating and looking for water and food. And it became standard operating procedure not to bypass any questionable dead enemy soldier without making certain he was dead. So without hesitation, Baker said, he fired into the foxhole. He was so close that when he shot the man, the blood splattered on him. These are the things that they went through, not just in the pitched moment of combat, but afterwards. So why do we remember Iwo? The real reason we have a program like this is because at 75 years it slipped from memory to history. We no longer have the people, very, very few of them are left, to tell us what happened. As we saw from that previous one, many don't tell us. The reality is, if we don't teach it, then those that follow will only know the name and not the sacrifice, will only know something happened, but not really understand what. Um, One of the things stated by one of the generals in charge, he suggested a special day happen, and seeking an objective like Iwo, only courage in the hearts of men and their willingness to give their all for their country makes victory possible. We bow our heads in humble appreciation to those who, never questioning, have made Iwo ours. And the Rear Admiral, Harry Hill, remarked, we ought to set aside a special day to commemorate the taking of Iwo Jima. Some people do. This is the Iwo Jima Memorial in Remsen, Iowa. That had stopped Ed O'Donnell when he was driving by one day. He said he was lucky there was no one behind him. He just stood on his brakes and stared. We remember all who sacrificed, and we thank those and their family for that sacrifice. So I'm hoping I've given you things to consider as to why we should look back on these battles. Hopefully you can answer these questions. How did we end up at Iwo? Why did it matter in the scope of the war? For the eventual victory, obviously, while it was not the location they took off from, those fighter pilots were able to provide cover for the bombers that would take the battle. Also, it mattered because, to be honest, the scale of the deaths to two divisions of Marines that were involved. There were three involved, but in reality, it truly made a great difference in the lives of two of those divisions. Said, what are we going to do when it comes to trying to assault the home islands? Is it even possible? And of course, that's another part that technology plays in the fact the atomic bomb will be used to end the war. By the way, in theory, 2,500 bombers would land at Iwo after receiving damages and things like that. So the 15 to 20 men crew of those bombers might actually go a long way toward that sacrifice of 6,800 Marines to take that island. I want to thank you for being part of this discussion today. If you have any questions, you can reach out to the museum. They would know how to get in touch with me. I do lots of these programs, and I want to thank you for your time and attention. And I'd like to thank the Sioux City Public Museum for all the great programs they put on, for the support they've given me in doing this program, and for all the wonderful pictures that they provided. That thank you also goes out to the Sioux City Journal for their great work over the years of recording local history in a way that people like myself and like you can go back and access. And thanks again to the pictures provided by the National Archives. But most of all, thank you for being interested in local history. This has been History at High Noon for the Sioux City Public Museum. My name is Russ Gifford, and thank you for watching.